We're going to continue with chapter 1 and talk about culture. What is culture? Culture has a lot of different meanings. You can think of it as high culture. If somebody's cultured, that is to say they're not uncouth. Like high culture can be associated with Shakespeare, with opera, the sometimes referred to as culture with a capital C. What we're talking about in this course is culture with a lower class C, not with a capital C. This is defined by the author as a pattern, a set pattern of values, beliefs, and behaviors shared by an identifiable group of people with a common history and using a verbal and nonverbal system of communication. A couple of things that are important here. It's a pattern. So there are certain things that tend to happen, that tend to be believed in this culture. These might vary with individuals, but there's an overall pattern of accumulated values or beliefs, behaviors. Has to be a group of people, though. That's a specific group. It might be a national group within a political boundary, but it might be a group of people who are separate from the mainstream group in a given country. One of the concepts we're going to be talking about in this chapter are microcultures, and there are a lot of those throughout the world. History can be a very important thing in terms of how a culture is constituted, and we'll be looking at some examples of that. And of course, how a group of people communicate, that can be the defining way that a culture sets itself apart from other cultures. There are a number of paradoxes we're going to be talking about in this course. One of those is that culture obviously is central to human identity. It's everywhere, it's pervasive, but it's not something that people tend to talk about. It's a little bit in that sense like language. Everybody uses language, but you kind of use it automatically. You don't think about language unless you start to learn a different language. Then you start thinking about language in general and maybe about your own language as well. Um, but particularly, culture is not something you think about if you're a member of the dominant culture of a particular country. If you're a member of a microculture, minority group, it may be something that you think about somewhat more. Culture is often presented as an iceberg. What's meant by that? Well, it's meant that at the bottom, that there are things that are important that you don't see. And these are this system of values, beliefs, behaviors, traditions that we talked about that are important in determining how people act, how people react. Then there are things that are visible, and what's visible, for example, is how people speak, how people use nonverbal communication, and the things that are really obvious at the top of the iceberg, cultural artifacts, that is to say, elements of popular culture, music, TV shows, how people dress, how people interact with one another. And we're going to be in this class trying to get at what's below the surface and what is often not taken into consideration when people communicate with others from a different culture. There's actually a academic discipline called intercultural communication that's fairly recent. It dates back to the 1950s. And most people, I think, would agree that it started with an anthropologist by the name of Edward Hall, who wrote a number of books about communicating with other cultures, one of those being Silent Language, published in 1956. Edward Hall had an interesting background. He worked for the State Department as a consultant. The State Department after World War II had some issues in the Foreign Service Institute with trying to train diplomats so that they would function well in other countries. And so Edward Hall worked to try to find ways to improve how diplomats did that. And so there was a very practical side to Hall's work. And we'll be talking about that, but be talking about kind of theoretical aspects of the discipline of intercultural communication as well. It's actually an area of study that combines a lot of different things. Cultural anthropology is kind of at the origins of intercultural communication, but obviously it involves as well international studies. We'll see that linguistics plays a major role a lot of times in terms of what the kinds of things that people look at in intercultural communication. It can be specific aspects of that. For example, the arts, music, ethnogastronomy, talking about food. Um, and so there are a lot of different aspects to intercultural communication that constitute the discipline, and that we'll be talking about to one degree or another throughout this class. This is the model that our author uses to talk about intercultural communication, uses a contextual model. And the model corresponds to the various chapters, and through chapter 8 at least, in terms of how the the author analyzes what takes place when people from different cultures communicate. And we're going to be starting really at the outside layer and working in. So we're going to be starting at the cultural context. What are the components of communicative competence? Well, there are a couple of things. If you want to be able to communicate with a person from your own culture or from a different culture, there are a few things that are important. One is cognitive knowledge. What's meant by that is knowledge, first of all, of how to communicate. But if we're talking about intercultural communication, that cognitive ability also refers to knowing something about that target culture. That can be a very helpful thing in effective intercultural communication. So if I know something about the history of the culture, if I know something about the cultural practices, if I know something about the language, about the non-verbal communication techniques that are used in that language and that culture, that can be very helpful. Affective refers to my attitude. If I want to to communicate, that's an important component in being able to communicate. If I really don't care, probably the conversation is not going to go too well. Behavioral component refers to the ability that I have to adapt my communicative style and techniques to those of the other person, and that's something we're going to be talking about quite a bit in this course in terms of both verbal and nonverbal communication. And obviously we also have to be aware that communication is situational, is dependent on the context in which a conversation takes place. And there it's important to be aware of what context you're in terms of how you communicate, how we approach communication. This is something that we'll be talking a lot as well about as well. These are some assumptions that the author makes about intercultural communication, and these are things that you can agree with or not. Something we'll be talking about. During intercultural communication, the message sent is usually not the message received. That might be kind of a surprising statement. That very often the message is not successfully received, or at least it's not received in the same way as the sender meant it to be received. This is an interesting statement, that intercultural communication is primarily a nonverbal act. Well, we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk more specifically about verbal versus nonverbal communication. But I think this may be kind of a questionable assumption given the rise of technology, and we'll talk about that later on. Intercultural communication necessarily involves a clash of communicator styles. One of the distinctions that's often made in terms of communication styles is between direct and indirect styles of communication. The American and Western European, German style of communication, for example, tends to be very direct. Well, that is to say that we say what we mean. That's even maybe more the case in Germany than the United States. Other cultures have a more indirect style of communication where they value politeness more, and maybe not saying as in as direct a way as Americans would tend to do exactly what it is they think. Initial cultural communication is a group phenomenon experienced by individuals. This may seem like a strange kind of statement, but what's meant by that is that when we come in contact with another person, we put that person into a category, into a group. How do we do that? Well, by the appearance of the person, the context in which that meeting takes place, what we know about that person, and obviously what's happening is at an individual level, but we are all members of groups, and when we interact, then we bring with us that knowledge of those other groups, and that knowledge may be a real knowledge or it may be based on stereotypes. Intercultural communication is a cycle of stress and adaptation. I think that most people would agree that that's often the case, that there's a degree of uncertainty leading to apprehension, leading sometimes to even hostility when we're dealing with a person who's very different culturally from ourselves. Hopefully, if the conversation continues, there is some adaptation that takes place and a lowering of stress, but it might not move in that direction. One of the things that we're going to be talking about throughout the course as well involves ethics. And there are different approaches to ethics, and we're not going to be talking about this in a theoretical way. We're going to be talking about this kind of applied ethics and applied to intercultural communication. And this is not a course in religious studies or philosophy, so we're not going to go into these in great detail. But in general, one can kind of divide ethical approaches to kind of a Western style approach and to a non-Western or Eastern style approach. And in general, the Western style approach kind of emphasizes the individual and individual rights. Individual, of course, also as a member of society and member of a group. But there's more emphasis on that than is the case in non-Western approaches to ethics. The utilitarian approach, I think, is well known. The greatest good for the greatest number of people. The rights approach is popular in the United States. Individual rights are considered by a lot of Americans as sacred. There's the sense that a lot of Americans have that there are kind of universal rights that apply to all countries. That's something that we sometimes see in American foreign policy. Social justice and fairness approach is something that obviously we want to promote. The idea that people need to be aware of uh, the consequences of their action than others with whom they interact, and the necessity for treating everybody equally, a fair way. Common good approach usually refers to the necessity to act in a way that's consistent with the norms of your group, and that the group, what's best for the group, is what should guide individual behavior. Virtues approach, often what's meant by that is that there are absolute values that are often come from Scripture, and that these are there are absolute rights and absolute wrongs. So as I was saying, in terms of Eastern approaches, there are some differences there. One is that in Confucianism and Hinduism, there's a recognition that not everybody is the same. It's very different from an American ethical approach, I think, which tends to want to see wants to assume that everybody is the same. In Eastern philosophy and Eastern traditions, that's not the case, that there's a recognition that people are different, that there's a hierarchy, and that that's a natural thing, that that we have to be aware of that and take that into consideration in our actions. So it doesn't mean, therefore, that everybody is treated necessarily in the same way. One of the other aspects that's different in this approach is that rituals can play an important role. There are certain things, certain ways that one does things, and what that means, if you're attaching some importance to rituals, for example, in Japan, in China, you don't have absolute freedom to behave the way that you want to behave, the way that you feel comes natural to you. That's kind of the way that Americans would see things. But rituals restrict your freedom of choice. So this is something we'll come back to throughout the semester. We'll be looking at kind of some examples, some case studies of ethics, but it's something that obviously is quite important.